little bit to cover.
Kiddish! I got everybody's attention.
Parshas Terumah describes in detail the construction of the tabernacle. It is a description that is given to us in this portion before the Torah describes the events that we call the golden calf. In other words, the way it's presented in the text is that this is some kind of ideal that the Almighty has, that we build a tabernacle. The tabernacle has vessels, the Mishkan has kelim, and then it happens to be afterwards, we're going to be reading in 2 weeks, a very unfortunate event of the people of Israel getting concerned that their leader is not back, creating some kind of image that will spiritually somehow connect them to the Almighty, Chet HaEgel. As we know very well, the rabbinic approach is that the construction of this tabernacle actually atones for the sin of the golden calf. That we humans do need vessels to connect to God. It is quite challenging for humans to connect to this untangible being called God, but we can only use vessels that the Almighty commands us to create. When we create our own vessels, even with the greatest of intentions, the results are basically pagan. What we have to be concerned of as well in our tradition is that even vessels that were given to us with the greatest of intentions, even vessels, even kelim, that were given to us with the greatest of intentions, if we put too much significance into them, we could turn them into an avodah zarah. Rabbi Meir Simcha of Devinsk, who we quote quite often, he notes that the breaking of the tablets, Moshe comes down from the mountain, has these wonderful stones etched by God, wonderful stones. They were there to inspire the people of Israel. Perhaps if we humans could gaze on stones created by the Creator, we could get the spiritual elevation and connection. Moshe comes down with this item, meets a nation that is worshiping a golden calf. What does he do? He breaks them. Notes the Meshach Chochmah Meir Simcha that if he would have handed such stones to a pagan nation, they would have worshipped those stones. In other words, yes, it's the handwork of God, but we have to keep things in perspective. We cannot place too much significance on something created. We have to remember that our goal is to connect to the Creator. It's a serious concern that exists even with Moshe himself. Rabbi Simcha takes this concept that we could take the valuable, we could take the significant, but make it too significant and thus destructive. He notes that Moshe couldn't have been the leader of the people of Israel in that generation that came into the land, because the generation that came into the land was affected by pagan culture. A pagan culture at times is going to worship some kind of force. At times it's going to worship a small idol, but at times it's going to worship a person. If Moshe Rabbeinu, the man, right, the legend, would have been with that next generation in the land of Israel, they would have worshipped him and corrupted Judaism. So it's a very significant message that Rabbi Simcha is addressing, because without a doubt he sensed it in his days, and how much more so in our days, that we have this great concern that people that play a very significant role in our faith, people who educate, people who inspire, people that this nation cannot survive without, but unfortunately at times we go ahead and put too much weight on the value of the person, and we make it into an avodah zarah. I was in Israel a few days ago, and what you do is, what I do, I'm not saying that it's the right thing to do, is, but I turn on the TV there to get a feeling of what's being discussed, right? What the culture is. Now, nowadays, in Israel, when I was a child, there was one channel, right? One channel only, and there was educational programs until 5:30 p.m., meaning I would turn on the TV as a child and I would have a Gemara shir. I'm not exaggerating. It was educational. They had English, they had math, they had science, and they had Talmud. So Shnai Mochasim, you could get it on the internet today. It's worthwhile to watch. Of a Talmudic, a lecture on Talmud, but geared to 4th and 5th graders. Wonderful, they do. 5:30 p.m. there was a little bit of Narishkeit for an hour, but that's basically it. And then the news at 9. One channel, very limited amount of television you would get. Times are better because when I was suffering from jet lag at 3 a.m., right before I took my shower on my way to the Kotel, I was able to turn on the TV and watch the tail end of a football game in Seattle, Washington, not on one but on 2 channels, right? So I was able to come home and tell my Moshe, who loves football, that yes, I did see the last play of the Seattle game at 3 a.m., finished up and made my way to the Kotel right after that. In any event, what was the Israeli news covering during the week that I was there, or really the Prime Minister was there? Not the Prime Minister of Canada, but a local issue. And the local issue had to do with Mekubal. There is someone who is a Kabbalist, and his name is Rabbi Pinto, his name is. He has a following, he's very inspirational. Some believe that he sees the unseen, correct? But unfortunately, the Mishtara, the police, is very close to an indictment on some monetary issues, right? Now, it's very unfortunate. It's very, very painful on many different levels. On one level, it's always this concern that the job of the observant community in Israel is to reach out, to inspire, to show them that they are rational like them, but yet committed to the values of Judaism. Those things don't help. But really, it is the byproduct of an attitude that we place these spiritual guides on a level that is way beyond the intention of Judaism, and it enters into the unhealthy realm, where these people are in essence worshipped. When someone stands hours to observe him, or would stand in line to kiss his hand, right? It perhaps has its place, but obviously in many groups, it goes beyond the gray into an area that is extremely problematic. And this is something that we have to be mindful in our culture, not to, God forbid, ignore the value of such people, that there are spiritual guys that play a very significant role in the welfare of our nation, but there has to be a check and balance. If Moshe Rabbeinu could have become one of those unfortunate pagan entities, how much more so to those in Israel? It was a very painful event. That's the first thing I have to see on television in the land of Israel. The Mishkan is going to be a very significant institution in our faith. Remember, here's a tabernacle where details are described regarding its construction. The vessels are spelled out, and these vessels are going to one day land up in the center of the world in Jerusalem. So they are extremely significant. No question about that. But what I like to do is find symbolic messages within them, meaning that they represent something. It is not just the vessel that is significant because God commanded me to create it. It is significant because I can analyze the type of material that's used. I can analyze how the Torah describes it, and then turn around and find a symbolic message. Now, there's danger with my approach as well, because if I make it only into something that's symbolic and do not give it anything that is intrinsic valuable, the result will be is I could take all of Torah and say, well, Torah is to teach me basically values, concepts, and I can manage very well without the practical Judaism. But we believe that we are balanced. We retain, we value the significance of the practical aspects, and therefore we do believe in the significance of the vessels themselves, but to keep them where they belong, we try to find some symbolic value. As you know very well, within the state of Israel, there are people that have a belief that this concept called the Third Temple is not one that we are just to wait passively for God to bring it down from heaven, but we are to play a significant role in creating it. So therefore, there are institutions that focus on studying the vessels of the temple, of the Klei HaMikdash. Now, you could get inspired by going to it, because you see individuals that are extremely committed to studying the details, analyzing different types of wool, trying to identify the true blue, and even trying to work with the dimensions, with appropriate dimensions to construct vessels. When you make your way to the Kotel on your next visit, or I'm sure you have seen it already, you see the menorah that was built, right? It used to be in the Cardo until about, 6 years ago, and now they got it a little bit closer to the Temple Mount, and you know very well that those who built it want to get it even a little bit closer to its appropriate location. It's a great tool in education. When I could turn to my son, when I'm walking there last week, and I show him that if you look carefully, there are designs on the branches that are almond-like. They are shaped like almonds. Where does that come from? So the Torah tells us in this week's portion that you are supposed to make designs that are meshukadim. So Rashi translates it as etched images. But if the Torah uses the word meshukadim, these are not just etched images, these are images that are almond-like. So when you see it, you retain it. It has an impact on you. No doubt it plays a very significant role. But what I'm trying to do is keep it balanced between the symbolism and the significance. They're both true. They are significant vessels. We do have faith, we do have a belief in a temple one day that will contain them. They are significant. However, I keep my Judaism balanced by focusing a little bit on symbolism, and we're going to talk a little bit about symbolism. Now, there are two vessels that symbolize Torah in the tabernacle and eventually in the Beit HaMikdash. Two such vessels. In other words, if you look, and if you have, I think, a picture on page, it's towards the end of the parasha, you will have turn to page 463. The layout of the tabernacle, the vessels are not presented there in detail, just the outer, the copper altar. And then you'll see the actual Mishkan. In the Mishkan itself, there are 4 vessels. Okay, so now, place yourself in the Mishkan. The first area, the entrance is where you see those 3 or 4 beams, those 3 or 4 poles. You walk in, you will be in the outer chamber. The outer chamber has smack in the middle a golden altar. It has on the south side the menorah. On the north side, it is going to have the shulchan, the table that contains the 12 showbreads. There's a partition, and on the other side of the partition, you will find the Holy Ark. The Holy Ark is the first vessel described in this week's portion. We are given its dimensions. We are told that you go ahead and plate it with gold on the inside and on the outside. That is vessel number 1. Vessel number 2, and turn to page 449, you will have a description of the shulchan, the table, which contains the showbreads. Vessel number 3 that is described is the menorah, and then the golden altar. They all, of course, symbolize different personalities. The people of Israel need priests. The priest is symbolized by the mizbeach, by the altar, because the altar brings us close to God, like the priest inspires us to be close to God. There is a shulchan. Shulchan symbolizes bread, royalty. Royalty, who is the family that is a carrier of the gene of royalty, the house of David HaMelech, King David. So therefore, their shulchan symbolizes the shulchan of Malchut. By the way, they had crowns. 3 out of the vessels had little crowns. The shulchan had a little crown on top of Zer, Zahav Saviv. The Aron, the Holy Ark, and the Holy of Holies had such a little crown. And The Mizbeach had a crown, and as the Rambam tells us, and as mentioned in Pirkei Avot, there are three crowns. There's the crown of Torah, there's the crown of Malchut, of royalty, and there's the crown of Kehuna. Then, but what we have to be mindful, and our focus is going to be that there are two vessels that symbolize the light of Torah. The Holy Ark, which is present in the Holy of Holies, which contains in it the Luchot, and then the menorah itself provides light. Light is wisdom. That too symbolizes Torah. So commentators wonder, what are we to learn from the fact that there are two vessels that symbolize Torah? What explanation to be given? So my father would explain, and this is found by others as well, that there are two types of Torah Jews. And the people of Israel actually need both. There are the ones who are committed to Torah and Torah only, which the Rambam calls such a person a Kodesh Kodashim. He is holy of holies. He does not interact with the world. He is there to preserve Torah. And by the way, we know very well that the reason we are around today as a nation is because 200 years ago and 2,000 years ago, there were people that committed themselves only to preserving Torah. And it remains in its precise mode because it's not impacted in any way, shape, or form. That's one Torah that exists. But at the same time, you need people who are like the menorah, who are not in the Holy of Holies. They are interacting and they are next to two vessels. They are next to the vessel that symbolizes spirituality, the Mizbeach, and they are next to the vessel that symbolizes livelihood, which is the Shulchan. And that is telling you that we need Torah Jews as well who interact with the world, who have to balance their life, who have to struggle a little bit with the fact that you have to support a family, but at the same time, commit yourself to the values and to the study of Torah and to the observance of mitzvot. Two types of Torah Jews exist, okay? Menorah and Shulchan. You know, during the Second Temple period, which one was missing? Which one of the two vessels that symbolize Torah, Aron, Menorah, which one was missing? The Holy Ark, right? It was concealed. Where did it go? So Indiana Jones, as you know, looked for it, right? But in our tradition, there are three different places mentioned where perhaps it was concealed. There's one opinion in the Talmud that it remained in Babylonia. There are two opinions that mention that it's in the temple itself. One place is it in a chamber in one area, one says that it's in an underground tunnel. Whatever it is, that's the traditional approach we take, that the Holy Ark remains there. But the temple was nevertheless functional, even though it did not have the Holy Ark, but it had the menorah. And the Second Temple period is symbolized by the menorah. The holiday of the Second Temple period is the holiday of the menorah. And that, of course, symbolizes something which I think is quite relevant to the world we live in. You know, we went last Wednesday, a week ago, it seems like a few years ago, but last week, Wednesday, the JNF placed the cornerstone for the future bird observatory and educational center in the Hula Valley in honor of the Prime Minister of Canada, right? Baruch Hashem. We've reached that state that in the 1950s, when you gave money to the JNF, it was building homes for people to take them out of the cold. And today we're taking care of birds. So the Jewish state is doing not too bad if you think about it. We're upgrading, right? People are no longer living in Ma'abarot. There was a movie called Salah Shabbati, which you remember, you probably even remember when it came out. But so there was... Baruch Hashem, I remember and I'm still traveling to the Dominican. So the people, I mean, when you study what happened in the Jewish state in the early years, there's so many things that amaze you. One of the most amazing things is the fact that here's a state that within a few short years doubles, triples its population and still functions. It wasn't perfect, but they still somehow managed, which is incredible. In other words, you think what's happening with refugees now from Syria, our people were refugees. They were running away from Arab countries, coming to a land, and somehow they survived. Was it perfect? Not exactly. But did they manage? Did they build a state? Yes, they did. It's mind-boggling, this success of the Jewish state. So now, JNF is honoring the Prime Minister of Canada. And I felt, and I was encouraged by others as well, that despite the fact that it was the day we were leaving, and it meant leaving Yerushalayim at 8 a.m., okay, 8 a.m. In other words, at past 11 o'clock, I was still sitting on a computer writing an update for my friends here in Toronto. And then I had to wake up at 6:20 to daven, pack, eat breakfast, and be on a bus by 8 a.m. to make it up to the Hula Valley. I could have stayed in Yerushalayim, but it was felt that if this is being done in the honor of the Prime Minister, and that's why we are there, it was the right thing to do. So we went. I was sitting behind Stockwell Day, and next to Larry Zeidman was there, and Rabbi Korupkin's there, and we made our way up to northern Israel. We were able to talk and learning with a few of the other rabbis. It was a very enjoyable trip up due to the company. We stayed there in the Hula Valley for a couple hours. I did a tour, a fascinating tour. You see these birds called the cranes, which, by the way, here in Canada we are accustomed to seeing larger birds, right? The Canadian geese. In Israel in general, the birds are much smaller throughout the country. Keep an eye out. You're not going to see Canadian geese. You're not going to see too many flamingos flying around. But when you come to the Hula Valley to see these gigantic cranes, and there were thousands of them, was a striking image. So we do the tour, and then we wait for an hour for the Prime Minister to come in. The Prime Minister comes in. He pours a little bit of the cement for the laying of the cornerstone, says a few kind words. He hops back on his helicopter to take his way to Tel Aviv, and we get back on the bus. And it was very, very significant, but Rabbi Korupkin expressed himself that wouldn't it be nice if at the same time that they are building this educational center, there should be at least one corner where birds in Jewish tradition, in Jewish law, in halacha, are mentioned. In other words, imagine if they would have one center where they teach the laws of sending away the mother bird, Shiluach HaKan, or a display of the different species of birds mentioned in the Torah. In other words, you have this feeling sometimes in Israel that there's this very, very strong presence of Torah in many communities. You walk into some communities where there are shuls and kollel every single block. But then you walk into the rest of the country, and it's a different world, right? It's really detached from it. What you want to see, and what exists, by the way, it does exist, but we want more of it, is where the two come together. Right? It used to strike me as a child, how I used to walk a lot in Yerushalayim. I would walk in Mea Shearim, and then I would walk to Yafo Street. And I always felt that I am covering 2 centuries in 10 minutes. Right? In other words, Mea Shearim is the values, the garb, right? The attitude, the way of life of the 18th century. And here I'm in the 20th century when I walk on Rehov Yafo. Rehov Yafo now gives you more of a feeling that you are in a land of tourists. English is the language that's spoken there. The prices, in other words, you want to get ripped off for a falafel, go to a tourist area. I could give you an address of a very good falafel store that I used to go 33 years ago. I had the privilege of visiting them again, which is half price and better quality. For friends, I'll be more than happy to share with you that information. But there's a divide. There's a divide that exists in the land, which is painful. And I've had many experiences where one moment you are interacting. In other words, I think I remember even hearing one of the non-Jewish MPs mentioning that it surprises him that there was no benediction, no blessing at the JNF dinner that occurred Tuesday night last week. In other words, there's something devoid of spirituality on the one hand, and on the other hand, you go into some neighborhoods, and the Torah, the study of it, the knowledge of Torah, by the way, is off the charts. We never had a generation when you had so many scholars. So what I believe in is that any tzedakah that you find, or any organization that is playing a role in trying to bring the two together, is the biggest mitzvah in the land of Israel. The biggest mitzvah. There's something called the Nachal Haredi, which is a way of somehow, and they are succeeding, again, baby steps, but all journeys begin with baby steps, of giving the opportunity and options for Haredim to serve in the army. Tremendous mitzvah, tremendous mitzvah. You keep them within a framework, but you are making the contribution, and it is good for the individuals, and it's good for the state, and it's good for the Jewish world. There are those organizations that exist, and we have to identify them, we have to support them, because that's what the state needs more than anything else. In the past 24 hours, there was a to-do in the news that Netanyahu's son is dating a Norwegian girl. A Norwegian girl. Now again,
According to Time magazine.
What?
According to Time magazine, is dating a shiksa.
A shiksa.
That was their headline.
That's their headline.
That was their front page.
Okay. Anyway, they nailed it. But now, I am not judging that on its own. That on its own is not something that we postle a person. In other words, you can't judge a person. It's a young man. His genetic makeup is one that has as they put it, a roaming eye. That's something that I'm not gonna go out and determine that the prime minister is a flawed individual. There was a statement circulating over the past 24 hours, which was far more disturbing, because there was a statement that he took pride in it when he had a conversation with the Norwegian prime minister. Now that has not proven to be true. That statement, which is much worse. In other words, I've heard, and this is something that we have to make clear, I've heard Prime Minister Netanyahu taking pride in his son, who came in third in his knowledge of Tanakh. And I've heard Prime Minister Netanyahu taking pride when he speaks to some of the Sephardim that I have a little rabbi at home. I've heard him taking pride in that, which is quite satisfying as someone that values the state and the individual. Him taking pride in this relationship has not been proven. So therefore, we still have the obligation of judging him favorably. Okay? But for me, it symbolizes a divide. It symbolizes a state that's functioning on a secular level and a religious one that is isolated. And the way this relates to the Mishkan, what's fascinating is the second temple functioned, correct? The vessel that was not there was the vessel in the Holy of Holies. In other words, you could have a temple without the holy Aron. You could have a temple without the vessel that symbolizes the Jew who is detached from the world. A Jewish world could function if you do not have the one that is detached. The Jewish world, there was never a time that you had a functioning temple without the menorah. Why? The menorah symbolizes the Jew who interacts, who symbolizes the Jew who is balanced, who understands that there is a requirement to bring bread to the table, and there's a requirement to have an altar at home, to go ahead and feel a spiritual connection to God. When you have such Jews, and they are involved in the marketplace, when you see them interacting with others, it elevates the state, it elevates the country. I remember there was a shliach of Torah Mitzvah in Memphis, Rabbi Goldberg, who talked about the words he gave to the group of Chayalim as they were going into Gaza in 2006. And he said that he was able to touch those from the most secular of backgrounds. He said, sharing with them words of Torah at that moment, he sensed an impact that remained. Why? He was interacting. In other words, if he would have been just studying, which has its purpose and has its value, or just praying, perhaps it would have been something good on the spiritual realm, but technically speaking, the impact wouldn't have been there. And I do see in Israel a change. In other words, there is a shift taking place. If you look at the media, we had the opportunity of seeing and interacting with the media a lot. Many of them in Israel have kippot today. There is a woman on Channel 2 television, and one of the TV news reports, that is wearing a sheitel, interacting with society, wearing a sheitel. Very impressive. There is a fellow with a Hasidic beard. They have on Channel 2 a report about the Knesset. So it's humorous. I mean, the whole Knesset is, in essence, humorous. But he gives a report with humor and with insight. A Hasidic guy with payas, speaking a perfect Ivrit, going through clips of the Knesset. It was exciting, not because he was just entertaining, but here's a fellow that is telling, you turn on the public and you see, here is a person that is preserving tradition, but yet at the same time knows what's happening and can interact. That's what elevates the country. So just keep that in mind. The menorah symbolized the Second Temple period. The Jewish state, by the way, the emblem of the Jewish state, if you go to the Knesset, or if you look at several of its coins, is going to be the menorah. The menorah is not in the Holy of Holies. The menorah is there next to the shulchan, next to the bread, next to the menorah, keeps it balanced. By the way, for those of you who like the significance of numbers in our tradition, number 7 symbolizes a natural cycle, the 7 days of the week, right? A person is to recover la'aleinu from a loss, the 7 days of Shiva. The branches of the menorah are 7, and they say that there are 7 branches of wisdom. It is the person that is familiar with the world, interacts, but yet keeps the value, and we can have a functional temple. So that's something that's symbolic, but I think talks very much to the existence of our tradition. Another area which plays a role, if you look at the construction of the Holy Ark, it has gold and it has what? Gold. The Holy Ark itself. The Holy Ark itself is gold and wood. Gold and wood. And the Torah tells us that you have to make it out of wood, but it should be tzipui, it should be plated from the inside and from the outside with gold. You would not see the wood at all. And it was not to cut corners financially. There was some kind of purpose of having a blend of gold and wood. So some commentators note that wood always symbolizes life. It's organic. It grows, right? You have the ability to develop it. You know, you have a tree in your background, and you could go ahead, and for sure in the earlier years, you could direct its growth if you want it growing in a specific direction. It's organic, it's full of life. And that symbolizes the oral tradition. The oral tradition has to be flexible, right? If you're going to go ahead and develop a system that is all metallic, where it has absolutely no flexibility and no life to it, unfortunately it could bring about the downfall of the system. Because you could go ahead and place the people of Israel, who are going through exiles, who are going through new environments, if you're going to go ahead and place them with a rigid system that has no flexibility, it will not survive. In other words, imagine a system of Torah that is given to a nation that is working in the fields, based on agriculture. You place them in Europe in the 11th and 12th century, where they are not allowed to own slaves, and thus they're not allowed to own property, and they enter into the industry of money lending. So imagine, and now if you are involved in money lending, there are times, and in some situations, the only option will exist if you have to lend money or borrow funds from another Jew. Imagine if you would have a rigid system with absolutely no flexibility, and you would have to tell people you're going to earn, you have to live in a society where money lending is the only way to survive. This system would no longer exist. So therefore, what did they develop? In other words, what did the oral tradition, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? The organic, the one that is alive, what was that able to form? A heter iska, system where there is an allowance. We talked about wine, right? So historically, in the 6th and 7th century, the rabbis followed the view that you're not allowed to even derive benefit from non-kosher wine. So if you went ahead and you had a non-Jewish neighbor and he owed you $1,000, and the only way to collect it was with barrels of wine, you were stuck in the 6th and 7th century due to a rabbinic decree. That became impossible in regions in Europe where, France for example, everything was based on wine. All collecting of funds was based on, it would not be possible for the Jew to survive with that prohibition of deriving benefit of Isur Hana'ah from wine. So the rabbis were able to reassess it all with the organic system of the oral tradition. However, what we have to remember is there are boundaries. In other words, you cannot say that the rabbis can allow everything. There are boundaries. And therefore, the gold covers, the gold sets the boundary for the wood. So if you want to think, if you want to find a symbolic meaning for the Holy Ark that has wood, but is covered, but it is placed and set in gold, it is that idea that yes, there is an organic system, there is a system that is alive and well, and the rabbis in every generation have the responsibility of assessing the realities, and within the system come up at times with leniencies, but at times with stringencies, but it has to be within the framework of gold. Symbolism is what this parsha is all about, and it makes its appearance in many, many different places and in many, many different details, from the shulchan to the mizbeach, to the Aron. It is all there. I think I mentioned Shabbos. Most people who hear Shabbos? No. Some of you were here Shabbos at that. You're at the Drosh of Shabbos upstairs? Okay, so I could mention one thing that's funny. Well, you came up. George came up. He was at Ashkama, and he came up to... Wow. So, when I was in the Knesset... Thank you. When I was in the Knesset, there was a lot of waiting. In other words, one thing I learned about flying as a delegate or as a part of the pamalia of the Prime Minister is that we are secondary. So there was a lot of waiting around, meaning the Knesset speech was at 6 p.m. Israel time. They got us there at around 4 o'clock. They put us in a room with a few, some drinks, thinking that would keep people happy. It did for 4 or 5 minutes. But then after that, we're all, just waiting around. The only person that had entertainment was Rabbi Kaplan from Flamingo, because he was able to ask everyone to put on tefillin. For everyone else. And watching him, by the way, is incredible. Yeah. He is incredible. It's hat off or whatever you do. So in any event, I was bored a little bit, but I knew my way around the Knesset. When I was a child, I used to hang out there. My aunt worked there. So I went downstairs to where the Chavrei Knesset leave the room itself, leave the chamber. So I became friendly with the guard there. He says, Tame Canada, yesh cafe tov sham, Starbucks. I say, no, Starbucks is not so good. That's what I told him. The second cup is better. So we have a schmooze there, and I start spotting Chavrei Knesset. And I had some interesting conversations with some of them. Some of them was just a Shalom Aleichem. Almost all of them were extremely friendly. I had a brief discussion with the head of the Agudas Yisrael, Rabbi Litzman, from the Agudas Yisrael. I'm not going to share exactly what he said, but I had a few conversations, and afterwards, eventually, I get back up. One of them was right after the Prime Minister spoke, and I ran back in. I saw Lapid and Mrs. Calderon leaving the chamber. Mrs. Calderon became well known because she gave a Gemara shir from the rostrum, from the podium in the Knesset. So I went over to Lapid, I thanked him, I welcomed him, and I told Mrs. Calderon that if I would have known that I'm meeting you, I would have brought my Gemara with me. That was my line that I was able to share with her. But in any event, afterwards we're waiting in the room. There's a big Chagall, nice Chagall, and we're waiting there, 200 of us, for the Prime Minister to enter. And I'm standing next to an individual, and I strike up a conversation with him. He was from the Philippines. He was the ambassador to Israel from the Philippines. Next to him was the ambassador to Israel from Vietnam. And I tell him, I took a course. We started talking about the Tet Offensive. He got very excited. He invited me to Vietnam, and he told me that Vietnam's could teach everyone about reconciliation because they believe that you're not supposed to be a slave to the past. Fine, give me some Buddhist insights. It was a nice conversation. And then afterwards, a fellow who obviously was from Africa walks by, and they tell me with great pride that he is from Cameroon. Now, it seems to be that the ambassadors to Israel have some kind of association. I don't know if they meet once a month for lunch, an association. And one of the ambassadors is the head of the Association of Ambassadors of Foreign Dignitaries to Israel. So, who would you think would be an appropriate person to be the head of such a group? So perhaps an ambassador from the United States, Canada, Germany, France, England, Russia, China, maybe. So they pointed out that the head of that association was that ambassador from Cameroon. The ambassador from Cameroon is the head, right, the most of all countries. And they explained to me that he's been there the longest for over 18 years, And the way one of the ambassadors said is that his country forgot about him. That's what he said.
Can't afford the airfare.
They can't. Could be that. Now, I'm thinking, now, how busy are you if you're the ambassador from Cameroon to Israel? In other words, how much trade is going on? How many tourists are coming from Cameroon? And how many Israelis are begging for entry into Cameroon, right? So this guy, imagine that, he has a choice, going back home or being a diplomat in a land that is blessed with everything, getting a nice salary, probably a driver, and a nice home in northern Tel Aviv. So obviously, he made the right choice to stay in the land of Israel. But there was something striking about the contrast that Israel now is viewed, right, as a country. Now, probably Cameroon came to birth, they got their freedom probably around the same time the state of Israel did, and we could do research. It was during that period of time that these European countries pulled back. Look what's happening in Israel and look what's happening in Cameroon, right? And the prime minister, right, had the sensitivity. One of his earliest statements in his address was basically that we have Canadians serving in Afghanistan. So many of their lives were saved by technology that was made here in Israel, Israeli technology. And his point is, in other words, Canadians, you think that I'm here only, bestowing the greatness of Canada for this small country. It's not the case. Israel is making a contribution that if we allow Israel and the Israelis to live in peace and do their part and become constructive, they could indeed do so much good for the world. And it's something that he understands. And it was a striking and an important message to Canadians that they should know what this country could do. And that was the impression that overall you get in the trip, that it's not big Canada helping Nebuch Israel. It's not the case. It is indeed two countries, and Canada realizes very well that their contribution in so many areas is great. What we have to do as observant Jews is to be sure that the contribution in the physical always retains the core spiritual element of our identity. And that's what's more important than anything else. Try to bring the two together. Bring spirituality to the marketplace, that we could continue with such contributions with technology, medicine. I mean, the amount of stories they have now of Syrian refugees, right, trying to get their way, to get help from the Israelis. I mean, that's what we are about. But let's keep in this book and these values, to keep the menorah symbol involved in the world that exists. That was that, and thank you for coming, and thank you for listening, and everyone have a wonderful day.